Ever feel like the world's changing too fast? One minute it's all like rotary phones, and the next it's practically killer robots flying around.
Well, maybe not killer robots exactly.
Okay, fair point.
But yeah, you're right. The whole evolution of drone warfare is a pretty wild example of how technology can just totally reshape war.
And not just how we fight wars, but what we even consider, ethical on the battlefields. It's like a whole different ballgame.
Exactly. And the thing is, it goes back way further than most people realize. We're talking all the way back to, like, the Wright brothers, even World War One.
Seriously, that far back, I would have thought this was a much more recent thing.
Oh, yeah, it's a surprisingly long history. And that's what we're diving into today, this whole journey from these like early prototypes that seem almost wacky now.
Wacky in a good way, or?
Oh, definitely some head scratchers in there.
I bet.
But yeah, we'll trace how they went from those early days to these like high-tech weapons we see today.
And I'm guessing the ethical side of things gets pretty complicated too.
Oh, absolutely. We'll be unpacking all that, the unintended consequences, what it means for the future, the whole nine yards.
All right, well, I'm ready to dive in.
Let's do it. So, where do you want to start?
Well, you mentioned World War One, and I know that conflict was just brutal, right? Like horrific trench warfare, millions of casualties.
Exactly. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen.
So how does precision bombing fit into all of that?
Well, that's kind of the starting point, right? You had this massive public outcry to find like a different way to wage war, something less destructive, less brutal.
I can only imagine. So military minds started looking for ways to minimize casualties, both for their own troops and civilians.
Exactly. And this whole concept emerged of going over the enemy instead of like through them. And technology was seen as like the key to achieving this.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So instead of these broad, indiscriminate attacks, the idea was to surgically target specific enemy resources, like factories and supply lines.
Right. Weaken their ability to fight without necessarily engaging in, massive ground battles.
So more strategic, more focused.
Exactly. They thought technology could make war more ethical, but as we'll see, it's not that simple.
It never is it?
Nope, not at all.
So this brings us to one of the earliest attempts at precision bombing, which you mentioned earlier. It was called the Kettering bug, right? Back in 1917.
That's the one, the Kettering bug. It was basically a really early drone, like an unmanned aerial torpedo.
Wow, so this idea of an aerial torpedo goes that far back.
Oh, yeah. They designed it to fly a preset distance, release its wings, and then just plummet down onto the target.
That's incredible. Did it actually work? I mean, it sounds a little...
A little out there.
Yeah, maybe more than a little.
Well, it was notoriously unpredictable. Sometimes it would even, like, turn back towards the people who launched it.
Seriously? The weapon turning on its makers? That's straight out of a sci-fi movie.
Right. But here's the thing. Even back then, the whole idea behind the Kettering bug was to reduce the risk to American lives.
So the intention at least was good, even if the execution was a bit off.
Exactly. They were trying to find a way to fight wars without putting soldiers in harm's way. And that intention, that drive to find a safer way, has been a constant throughout this whole evolution of drone warfare.
I guess that makes sense. You can see how even if the Kettering bug itself was kind of a flop, it still foreshadowed what was to come.
Absolutely. And that desire for precision, it just kept fueling technological development.
Okay, so what came next? What was the next big leap forward?
Well, a major step forward came with the Norden bomb sight in World War II. Maybe you've heard of it.
Yeah, the Norden bomb sight. It was this really complex device that helped bomber crews hit their targets more accurately.
Precisely. It was basically a sophisticated analog computer taking into account all these factors like altitude, wind speed, even the Earth's rotation.
Wow. All to calculate the exact moment to release a bomb.
Yep. The goal was to minimize civilian casualties.
So, again, we see that intention to make warfare more precise, less indiscriminate. But how successful was it in reality?
Well, that's where things get a little messy. While the Norden bomb sight did improve accuracy, it was also used in some of the most devastating bombing campaigns of the war, including the firebombing of Tokyo.
Right, right. That's kind of a chilling reminder that even technology designed with good intentions can be used for really destructive purposes.
Exactly. And it shows this constant tension in warfare, trying to be precise, but also dealing with these unintended consequences that are often horrific.
So, moving on from World War II, how did things evolve during the Vietnam War? I mean, Drones must have played a role there too, right?
Yeah, definitely. The Vietnam War saw the development of the lightning bug, a drone mainly used for reconnaissance and as a decoy to protect pilots.
So kind of like a scout and a shield, all in one.
Exactly. It was small, disposable, and seen as a success because it potentially saved a lot of pilots' lives.
Even though over 200 of them were shot down.
Yeah, even with those losses, it raises this question of like how we even measure success in war.
Right, because is it just about minimizing casualties on our side, or is it about something bigger than that?
Exactly. What's the broader impact? What's the human cost on all sides? Tough questions.
Really tough. And I feel like drone warfare only makes that calculation even more complicated.
It definitely does. And we see that complexity becoming even more apparent in the Gulf War, where drones really started to take center stage.
The Gulf War, right.
Mm.
That's where we see those crazy stories of Iraqi soldiers trying to surrender to drones.
It's wild, isn't it? Just shows the psychological impact of these unmanned eyes in the sky, always watching.
It's like this new dimension of fear and uncertainty on the battlefield.
Totally. And it really changed the nature of war itself, how battles are fought, the impact on everyone involved.
And that was just the beginning, wasn't it? Didn't Gulf War also mark a pretty big shift in how drones were used?
It did. While they were mainly reconnaissance tools before, they started to play a more active role in enabling those precision strikes we were talking about earlier.
So from watching to actually targeting.
Exactly. And that shift had some pretty major consequences as drone technology kept advancing. But you know what? I think we need to pause here for a moment and let all of that sink in.
Yeah, good idea. The story of drone warfare is already so complex, and we've only just scratched the surface. We'll be back in a moment to continue our deep dive.
So before the break, we were talking about how the Gulf War kind of became this turning point for drones, right? They went from being mainly about observation to playing a much more active role.
Yeah, it's like the shift from just watching to actually being able to target and attack.
Exactly. And that shift from observation to action really took off in the years after the Gulf War.
Driven by like all the new technology that was coming out.
Yeah, partly, but also the nature of conflict was changing, becoming more about these like surgical strikes and less about those big drawn out battles.
So what was the next big step in the evolution of drones? What happened next?
Well, the next major leap was when they started arming drones with Hellfire missiles.
Wow, so now they weren't just providing intel, they were actually able to deliver like a serious punch.
Exactly. Those unmanned aircraft went from just being eyes in the sky to actually being able to carry out attacks.
That feels like a huge leap. When did that happen?
Well, the first armed Predator drone strike, it took place in Afghanistan in 2001.
2001, right after 9/11.
Yep, exactly. The U.S. was launching its war on terror, and drones quickly became a key part of that.
And the target of that first strike was Mullah Omar, right?
That's right. And even though that first strike didn't actually eliminate him, it really marked the beginning of a new era.
Like the age of lethal drones.
Exactly. And it's fascinating how the evolution of drone warfare has been so closely tied to all these major world events.
Yeah, totally. Like I'm thinking about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also how the public was becoming less and less tolerant of U.S. casualties. That must have played a role too, right?
It definitely did. And all of that, combined with the need to combat terrorism, really created this perfect environment for drone warfare to take off, especially under President Obama.
Right. Obama was even called the drone president because of how much his administration relied on them.
Yeah, he really embraced drone warfare as a central part of U.S. military strategy.
And it wasn't just about going after those high-value targets, right? Didn't they also start using what were called signature strikes?
Oh, yeah. Signature strikes were a whole other thing. Basically, instead of having specific intel on an individual, they were targeting people based on patterns of behavior.
So like what they were doing or where they were, rather than who they actually were.
Exactly. If they fit a certain signature, that was enough to make them a target.
That sounds incredibly risky, and I bet it was super controversial.
It was hugely controversial because a lot of times those signatures were really broad and based on pretty flimsy intelligence.
So a lot of room for error.
Yeah, and that led to a lot of civilian casualties, which obviously raised some serious ethical questions about, the accuracy of drone warfare and who is actually being held accountable.
Right, because even with the most advanced technology, there's always the chance for mistakes.
And in war, those mistakes can have devastating consequences.
Absolutely. And then there was that really high-profile case of Anwar al-Awlaki. Wasn't he a U.S. citizen who was killed in a drone strike?
Yeah, al-Awlaki was an al-Qaeda leader, but he was also a U.S. citizen, and he was killed in a drone strike in Yemen in 2011.
I remember that case causing a huge uproar. Didn't it raise all sorts of questions about, like, targeted killings and due process, especially when it involved U.S. citizens?
Oh, yeah, it was a landmark case, no question. People were debating the limits of executive power, the legal framework around drone warfare, the whole thing.
It's like every advancement in drone technology just brings with it a whole new set of ethical and legal dilemmas, you know?
It's true, it's true. It's the challenge with any emerging technology, especially when we're talking about something with such huge life or death implications.
Because technology moves so fast, but our ability to figure out the consequences, to like wrap our heads around it all, that moves a lot slower.
Exactly. It's like we're constantly playing catch up.
So Obama really expanded the use of drones, even with all that controversy. But how did things change under President Trump?
Well, under Trump, drone warfare escalated even further. He actually relaxed some of the targeting rules that Obama had put in
So
place.
potentially even greater risk of civilian casualties.
That was the big worry, yeah. A lot of critics were really concerned about that. And then, of course, there was the targeted killing of Qasem Soleimani in 2020.
Soleimani was a top Iranian general, and that drone strike, ordered by Trump, it killed him in Iraq.
Yeah.
And that was a massive escalation of tensions between the U.S. and Iran.
It was a huge deal. I mean, it really showed the world just how powerful and far-reaching drone warfare had become.
But it also raised a ton of questions about international law, right?
Absolutely. We're talking about the deliberate killing of a high-ranking military official from another country, and it didn't even happen in an active war zone. It was in a third country.
So what kind of precedent does that set? I mean, if the U.S. can do that, what's to stop other countries from doing the same thing?
Exactly. And that was the big question that a lot of international legal experts and world leaders were asking. Like, what happens if this just becomes the norm, you know?
It's a pretty scary thought to imagine countries just routinely using drones to take out their rivals, like completely bypassing all the traditional rules of war and diplomacy.
It's a chilling thought for sure. And then you add on top of that the fact that drone technology is becoming more and more accessible.
You mean how drones are getting cheaper and easier to buy?
Exactly. They're not just the tools of powerful nations anymore. We're seeing them used by all sorts of groups now, like
Yeah.
non-state actors, rebel groups, criminal organizations, even individuals.
So it's like the technology is becoming democratized, but in a really dangerous way.
That's the fear, yeah. We're looking at the very real possibility of widespread drone proliferation, where these weapons are everywhere and the lines between war and peace get even blurrier than they already are.
And that has huge implications for how we'll fight wars in the future.
Huge implications. And then, to make things even more complicated, you have the rise of autonomous drones, these unmanned aircraft that can operate without any direct human control.
Autonomous drones. That sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. Are we really at that point already?
We are, and that's a whole other conversation about accountability and the role of human judgment in war. I mean, it really makes you question the very nature of conflict in the 21st century.
It's a lot to process for sure. I think we need to pause here and let this all sink in. We'll be back in a moment to explore these questions about what the future holds for drone warfare. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here talking about the evolution of drone warfare.
Yeah.
You know, starting with those early attempts at precision bombing that seem almost quaint now to the really sophisticated and sometimes kind of scary reality that we're facing today.
And like we've been saying, every time the technology takes a step forward, it seems like a whole bunch of new ethical and legal challenges pop up right alongside it.
Totally. And at the end of the last part, we were talking about those autonomous drones, the ones that can basically operate on their own without any human controlling them directly.
Right. And that raises some really big questions about the future of warfare. Like, can we really trust machines to be making life or death decisions out there on the battlefield?
It's a wild concept to think about. You know, we've already talked about how controversial those signature strikes were and the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, but at least there were still humans in the loop making those calls.
Right. There was still some level of human judgment involved. But with autonomous drones, it feels like we're taking that out of the equation entirely.
So what are people saying about that? Like, is anyone actually arguing that it's a good idea to have these machines making those kinds of calls?
Well, some people argue that it could actually make warfare more ethical, believe it or not.
Really? More ethical? How do they figure that?
The thinking is that if you take human emotions and biases out of the equation, you're left with these purely rational machines that can make decisions based on like cold, hard data.
So they're thinking these machines could target enemy combatants with, like, pinpoint accuracy and minimize civilian casualties.
Exactly. But, even if you could somehow guarantee that kind of perfect accuracy, which is a big if, I think there are still so many things that could go wrong.
Oh, yeah. Tons of potential for things to go sideways. What if the drone malfunctions? Or what if it, like, identifies a target?
Right, and what about hacking? What's to stop terrorists or criminals from getting their hands on these things and reprogramming them?
Yeah, it feels like there are more questions than answers here.
There are, and that's why there's been so much debate about this, not just among like the military folks and politicians, but also ethicists, legal scholars, you name it.
So, big picture, where do we go from here? Is there any way to develop this technology responsibly, without it all going completely off the rails?
Well, I think the first thing is we have to acknowledge just how risky this stuff is. We can't just pretend that those risks don't exist.
Right, like burying our heads in the sand.
Exactly. We need to be having some serious conversations about this, and not just within individual countries, but globally. Like, we need some international agreements on the ethical and legal frameworks for all of this.
That makes sense. Some kind of guidelines or regulations to make sure things don't get out of control.
Exactly. Ideally, something like international treaties that everyone agrees to.
So what would those treaties look like? Like, what kinds of things should they be focusing on?
Well, for one thing, they need to address the issue of human oversight. Even with autonomous weapons, there needs to be a human in the loop somewhere, someone who's ultimately accountable for what these machines do.
Because once we cross that line, once we hand over complete control to machines, it's hard to imagine how we could ever go back.
It's a Pandora's box situation, for sure.
So, really, we have a choice to make, don't we? Either we let technology just run wild and dictate how wars are fought, or we step up and say, no, there are certain lines we're not going to cross.
Exactly. We need to make sure that technology is serving humanity, not the other way around. And that takes a conscious effort.
It all feels pretty overwhelming, to be honest. Like, I'm just one person. What can I really do to make a difference here?
Well, that's where being informed comes in. The more people understand what's at stake here, the more they'll demand that their leaders take this seriously.
So, educating ourselves, talking about this with our friends and family, contacting our elected officials, all that matters.
It all matters. Because this isn't just some abstract issue for academics to debate. The future of warfare is being decided right now, and it's something that will affect all of us.
Well said. I think after this deep dive into the world of drone warfare, I'm feeling a mix of emotions. On the one hand, it's amazing to see how far technology has come, but on the other hand, it's pretty unsettling to think about what could happen if we're not careful about how we use it.
It's a complicated issue, no question, and I think it's important to acknowledge both the potential benefits and the very real risks of this technology.
For sure. We've only scratched the surface here, and we could easily spend another few episodes just talking about this. But for now, I'd encourage everyone listening to check out the resources we've linked in the show notes.
Yeah, there's a ton of great information out there if you want to dive deeper into any of this.
And remember, the future isn't set in stone. What happens next with drone warfare, it's up to us to decide.
It's up to all of us. So keep asking those tough questions, stay informed, and let's work together to build a future where humanity comes first. Until next time.
Until next time.